Welcome to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Last week we were looking at the India-Pakistan border and the insights that systematically gathered data can give us on the incidence of violent clashes there. This week we turn to the Indo-China border. A number of incidents involving the armed forces of both sides appear to have taken place since early May near the borders between the Tibet Autonomous Region and Ladakh and Sikkim. On 15 to 16 June in particular in the Galwan River Valley, fighting reportedly resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and 43 Chinese casualties. There have also been reports of soldiers from both sides being captured and subsequently released. This was the most fatal clash between the two sides since the 1962 border war, and there were initial fears that the violence could spiral into a substantial conflict. But India and China have both held back from any escalation. Today, Michael Kugelman joins us from Washington, D.C. to talk about the Galwan incident, its background, how India and China are responding, and what the regional and wider international implications might be. Michael Kugelman is the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center. His specialty areas include Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and US relations with each of them. His recent projects focused on India's foreign policy, US-India relations, India-Pakistan relations, the war in Afghanistan, and US policy in South Asia. He is a regular contributor to publications that include Foreign Policy, The National Interest, and CNN.com. In January 29, Michael co-hosted the joint RSAA Wilson Center Conference on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Recordings of the whole event are on the RSAA YouTube channel if you wish to watch it. It's a pleasure to welcome him back with us today. Could I just remind members of the audience that if you wish to ask Michael a question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Please post your question there. We cannot promise to answer all questions raised, but we will do our best. Michael, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate the kind introduction. It's great to be with you again. And indeed, as you mentioned, the Wilson Center and RSAA have hosted several fruitful collaborations. I hope there'll be more of them in due course, especially when the world returns to normal, whenever that may be. But at any rate, I will make my comments in several parts, and I think you've nicely previewed them just before. First, I'll say just a bit about the broader India-China relationship to provide some context. I'll then turn to the current border crisis in Ladakh and highlight some potential drivers of the crisis, the state of play right now, how things may play out, and finally some discussion of the geopolitical consequences. So first, I'll set the stage with some comments on the broader relationship. To put it very mildly, it's a complex relationship. On the one hand, the two have long enjoyed a robust trade partnership. It may be weighted heavily in China's favor, but nonetheless, it is by volume one of the largest bilateral trade relationships in the world. Additionally, bilateral diplomatic ties have actually been fairly cordial over the last few years. You'll all recall that there have been several summits between the Indian and Chinese leaders, one in China, one in India. It's also easy to forget, given how things are now, that India and China share a series of similar foreign policy interests. They partner fairly extensively on the world stage. They have similar views on issues like counterterrorism and the importance of connectivity and infrastructure projects. They also work together in a number of influential global forums, such as the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperative Cooperation Organization, and of course, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. New Delhi and Beijing are both all about increasing their presence on the global stage, and they take their cooperation within these multilateral groups very seriously, as it provides them with prominent platforms to project global influence. At the same time, India has long viewed China as its biggest strategic competitor, and a number of factors inhibit deeper partnership. Of course, one of them is a disputed border, which was the subject of a war between India and China back in the 1960s. But also there are factors like China's close partnership with Pakistan, India's bitter rival, as well as Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, the global infrastructure super project that extends well into India's backyard. Another factor that inhibits partnership between these two powers, and it seemingly condemns them to perpetual rivalry, is more structural. I would argue that both India and China can be classified as civilizational states. That is, they are both incredibly large. They are both very old with long, deep, and rich histories. They are also consequently, and not surprisingly, both very proud states, and they extol their own respective brand of exceptionalism. Each one oftentimes views itself as superior to the other, and one hears this in having private conversations with officials and even analysts from both countries. Even a sense that each side tends to look down on the other in some contexts. Now, that said, it is striking that just in recent days, I've had some conversations with Chinese analysts who have tried to put a more positive spin on this civilizational state framework. They have argued to me that there is an inter-civilizational relationship with a shared history forged through being linked as neighbors for thousands of years. Now, I do think that we can chalk this up to being a mere attempt to try to put a happy face on the sad state of affairs that is the India-China relationship right now. But I do think it's striking nonetheless to see this attempt to look at the rival civilization state dynamic through a glass half full lens. But let's return to BRI for just a moment, the Belt and Road Initiative. BRI, I would argue, is the biggest current accelerant of India-China rivalry in South Asia. But it is most certainly not the first. For years, Beijing, in order to secure new markets for its fast-growing economic and energy needs, has been pursuing influence and investments across Asia, including South Asia. Indian government officials, many Indian government officials have long feared that China, through its pursuit of infrastructure projects, roads, power grids, ports, in areas surrounding India, is developing a, quote, string of pearls strategy that is meant to metaphorically encircle India. And yet BRI has intensified these concerns as it entails scaled up investments in India's broader backyard, and especially next door in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or Cpec. Cpec is by far the most operationalized component of BRI. It entails billions of dollars of infrastructure projects, including the development of a port in the southern Pakistani city of Gwadar, a port that India fears that China may use for military purposes, such as to house naval vessels in due course. China and Pakistan both deny there are any military dimensions to Cpec. China denies there are any military dimensions to BRI more broadly, but New Delhi and Washington, for that matter, are suspicious. The fact that the dimension of BRI enjoying the most forward movement so far is in Pakistan is particularly troubling for India, given that Pakistan is India's bitter enemy and China's close ally. And indeed, the China-Pakistan partnership really is another main driver of this China-India rivalry. China uses Pakistan as a foil to India. Beijing tries to strengthen Pakistan's capacity to push back against India, which benefits both China and Pakistan. China helped Pakistan build its nuclear weapons program. It has provided extensive military support. It is also one of the few countries that helps Pakistan pursue its interests abroad. China offers to convene meetings at the UN on Kashmir, something Pakistan always wants and India never wants. It uses its permanent UN Security Council membership status to block efforts by India to get India-focused Pakistani terrorists sanctioned at the UN. And China has also blocked efforts by India to enter the prestigious nuclear suppliers group. Now, India has sought workarounds to deal with China's growing clout in the region. New Delhi has sought to pursue multilateral connectivity projects with the smaller countries of South Asia, as well as Myanmar. Additionally, India has committed in partnership with Afghanistan to develop the port of Chabahar in southern Iran. And this project is meant to facilitate, through roads and a railway, among other things, Indian access to markets in Afghanistan and further afield to the gas riches of Central Asia. The problem is that these India-led multilateral connectivity projects are in their very early stages, and the Chabahar project has struggled from the start because of stepped up US sanctions on Iran and New Delhi's desire not to violate them. At any rate, just over the last 24 hours, Iran has decided to move on with this Chabahar infrastructure project without India. Now, a few years, we got a glimpse of what the future could bring for India-China relations, and it really was prophetic in terms of what's happened along the border in Ladakh. For several weeks during the summer of 2017, India and China were embroiled in a tense border standoff in a highly strategic area of the Himalayas known as Doklam. India and its close ally Bhutan view this land as Bhutanese territory, while China claims it as its own. The dispute began when Chinese forces attempted to extend a border road, prompting Indian troops to enter the area. There was no serious fighting, just some pushing and shoving, sort of like a playground brawl, a lot of people pushing each other around. But despite the lack of real fighting, the two countries' militaries were staring each other down for several weeks. The Doklam standoff was nothing new for India and China. There have been many standoffs like it in the past, but that standoff did stand out for three reasons. First, it involved a third country, Bhutan. Second, it was the first time that Indian troops engaged with China on the soil of a third country. And third, the location was very significant. The Doklam Plateau is highly strategic real estate, to say the least. It leads to the Siliguri Corridor, a narrow area of land that connects northeastern India to the rest of the country. And even more crucial is that the location was and is within India's sphere of influence. In recent years, I would argue that China has sought not only to deepen its influence in areas of South Asia where it already has a deep footprint, like Pakistan and Bangladesh and Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, but it's now also trying to extend its influence to areas like Bhutan, where India's influence has traditionally been much stronger than China's. Clearly, in the case of the Doklam standoff, Beijing wanted to test India to see how it would respond when it tries to stage acts of provocation in areas firmly within India's sphere of influence. So as I said before, I would argue that the Doklam crisis was prophetic. It set the stage for the current crisis in Ladakh. Another case of, in my view, a Chinese provocation in a highly strategic space, in an area very much within New Delhi's sphere of influence, meant to test India to see how much the Indians will let the Chinese get away with. Now, I do not wish to overstate the similarities between the Doklam and Ladakh crises. In fact, they're quite different. The main reason being that the Ladakh one has been so much more serious, the most serious India-China border spat for many years. And that's because, first of all, there were combat fatalities for the first time in 45 years along the line of actual control. And the provocations this time around were so much stronger than they've been in the past. Chinese forces entered at multiple points territory that India considers its own, and they stayed there, even up to now. So how did we get here? What might have triggered this current crisis in Ladakh? The truth of the matter is that we don't know for sure. Information shortages have been plentiful in the sense that all of this is playing out in very remote terrain. It's difficult, if impossible, for media to get there. We have to depend on official messaging from the Indian and Chinese governments. We always have to take that with a grain of salt, along with state-run media in China, and also Indian media coverage, which tends to base its reportage on a lot of anonymous sources. So what exactly is going on has never been completely clear. So I think that all we can do is offer several possibilities that, if you consider them collectively, I think can be seen as major contributing factors that precipitated the crisis. And I would argue that while there are several local factors that sparked this crisis, there were even more broader geopolitical considerations that fueled the current spat. But first, in terms of local drivers, local factors on the ground in Ladakh that led to this crisis. Certainly, Indian infrastructure building on its side of the LAC is clearly a driver. This has been going on for quite some time. In particular, there is one road that was completed last year, which stretches all the way from Leh, the capital of Ladakh, all the way down near the Karakoram Pass. This is miles and miles of strategic roadway, and it allows India to project power across a large expanse of Ladakh and to better protect and defend its territorial claims. China finds this as highly provocative. But let's be clear, road building along the LAC, the line of actual control, is not a new provocation. Both sides do it all the time. It sparked many border spats in the past, including the Doklam one, which was sparked by Chinese road building. And yet the border spats over the past few decades triggered by road building have not been nearly as serious and violent as the current one is. So there's a puzzle here. Why is that? And I think it's because road building was not the only trigger for the current spat, not by a long shot. there are a series of other factors, all of them broader and more global. And I'll briefly highlight some of them. First, consider China's overall foreign policy. In recent months, Beijing has adopted an increasingly assertive and, one might argue, provocative and muscular and even aggressive foreign policy meant to better pursue its interests overseas, and that includes reasserting territorial claims. Beijing itself has given this new muscular policy a name: wolf warrior diplomacy. It's a very colorful name. And what have we seen in recent months since China designated this new policy as wolf warrior diplomacy? Well, we've seen Chinese provocations in the South China Sea. We've seen it use increasingly bellicose language addressed at Taiwan. We've seen it step up its game in Hong Kong in troubling ways. And I think it is within this broader global context that we should view China's unusually robust provocations, multiple incursions in many areas along the LAC in Ladakh. I think that this wolf warrior diplomacy also explains why Beijing has acted very assertively during the course of the coronavirus pandemic, not just in Ladakh, but also in the South China Sea and beyond. China knows that it has suffered a major blow in the court of global public opinion, as many key capitals, including India, have been extremely critical of Beijing for its poor initial handling of COVID-19 and for causing the virus to become a deadly pandemic because it didn't do enough to weaken it within its own borders, thereby allowing it to become a pandemic. There's been a lot of criticism of China along those lines. Beijing, finding itself on the defensive, one could argue, has had to go on the offensive to telegraph defiance, toughness, and strength. And I think this also helps explain to an extent why China acted boldly in Ladakh. Another key geopolitical driver of the China-India spat, I would argue, is the US-India-China relationship. I think we all know the US-China relationship is a toxic mess right now. It's at one of its most hostile points in years, but it's gotten a lot worse in the last few years, even in the last few months. It's arguably about as tense as a relationship can be without being in a hot war. By contrast, the US-India relationship is on the ascent. It's been growing exponentially since the early 1990s, and especially since the early 2000s, but it has experienced considerable growth. In the Trump years, I would argue that it is one of the few key US bilateral partnerships that has not suffered in the Trump era. And a main reason why is rising concern between the two about China's activities in Asia, or in the Indo-Pacific, to use the key term of debate. The signature US-Asia policy, its Indo-Pacific strategy, is all about counterbalancing China, and it envisions India playing a key supporting role in that game. So looking at what's played out in Ladakh, we can read Beijing's moves as an effort to send a defiant message to both Washington and New Delhi. In effect, if you two are going to band together against China, then be ready to get pushed back. A third key geopolitical factor that I think can help explain the Ladakh crisis is India's repeal of Article 370 of its constitution last August. Now, most people think of this for having eliminated the special autonomous status of Jammu and Kashmir, India-administered Kashmir, which is true. But India's repeal of Article 370 of its constitution also incorporated Ladakh into an Indian Union territory. And so, in effect, in the eyes of Beijing, it made a change to the status, unilaterally so, of a region to which China has a claim. So consider what happened in the weeks and months after India made that move on August 5th, 2019. On August 6th, 2019, the very next day, China's foreign ministry released a statement strongly rejecting India's move. That same day, India's Interior Minister, Amit Shah, made a speech in which he declared that Aksai Chin is a part of India. Aksai Chin is an area of Ladakh that is currently controlled by China. A few weeks later, on September 11th, 2019, according to an investigation just recently published by the Indian journalist Sushant Singh, there was a brief clash between Indian and Chinese forces in Pangong Tso, the lake area a lake area in Ladakh that has become a ground zero for the current spat. Then in early November, India's government released new maps of India depicting the post-Article 370 repeal changes, and China did not respond well to those new maps. Now, at this point, the weather had gotten really bad in Ladakh because it's Ladakh where the weather is oftentimes bad. It remained bad until we got to the spring of this year. And then in May 2020, the current Ladakh crisis began. Now, to be sure, this chronology does not at all prove causation between the Article 370 repeal and China's decision to make incursions in Ladakh, but I think it does highlight the strong likelihood that it had something to do with it. So where are we now? The situation is very fluid, and as always, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on. There have been talks between the two sides continuously, and there are reports that Chinese forces are starting to disengage from areas where they had made incursions in areas of territory that India considers its own. We really don't know the details. We don't know how much they're disengaging. We don't know what the Indians are doing in return. And so the bottom line is that tensions remain very high on the LAC. Emotions are still incredibly raw. The violence during the bloody clash of June 15th was incredibly savage. Again, this is when you had this highly unusual, deadly spat between the two countries that led to the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers, and we don't know how many Chinese soldiers. There were no firearms were discharged in that bloody clash. The violence was extremely savage, though. Soldiers were beaten with nail-studded rods. Some of them were thrown down into the Galwan River. Troops died from ruptured arteries and hyperthermia. It was terrible. And again, there was no use of firearms in this case. This was all through the use of crude, primitive weapons. So even though talks are ongoing and there are some signs of disengagement, I would argue that the India-China military relationship and the relationship on the whole remains on tenterhooks. For that reason, I would argue that neither side will be in the mood to make major concessions in negotiations. And yet, if you want to end this crisis, you need to make concessions. You need to compromise. I would argue as well that China has much of the leverage right now, given that it's the stronger of the two parties. It has troops, it still has troops stationed on the Indian side of the LAC. Wolf warrior diplomacy is not about unilateral disengagements without getting something in return. And yet India is also not going to back down easily. It has a nationalist government under tremendous pressure to do something and push back harder against China. And yet India, as the player with weaker conventional military forces, has limited military options in terms of retaliations. It does have economic options. It started to retaliate economically by reducing trade ties, but I would argue that these retaliatory steps, like banning nearly 60 Chinese apps in India, including TikTok, these steps will not prompt China to back down on the border. And in fact, India incurs considerable risks in trying to punish China economically, given that China is a key economic partner of India's. And China has invested in key economic sectors like telecoms and automobiles, manufacturing more broadly, sectors that have really struggled in India of late. India is suffering through one of its worst economic crises in years, and that was before the pandemic hit. It's gotten even worse now. So this is a very risky time for India to be pushing away a top commercial partner, and yet the pressure is on the Modi government not to back down. So I imagine that we may have to wait until the late summer when the weather starts getting bad for the status quo ante to return, in effect for the Chinese and Indian soldiers to return to their positions before the crisis began. But before then, given how tense things remain, the risk of another provocation or a miscalculation or something leading to an escalation is very real. But let's step back now from speculation on where things go, and I'll conclude by focusing a bit on some of the major geopolitical implications emerging from this spat. First, the Ladakh crisis underscores India's growing diplomatic problems in its own backyard. It now has a hot border, a very tense hot border with both of its top rivals, Pakistan and China. Beyond that, India is mired in another border crisis with Nepal, which is a country that has had a very close partnership with India for a number of years. India's relationship with Bangladesh has taken a plunge in recent months thanks to a new citizenship law in India that Dhaka takes issue with because it believes the law accuses Bangladesh of being discriminatory toward religious minorities. India keeps getting written out of a peace and reconciliation process script in Afghanistan, even as many other key regional players, including Pakistan, are very engaged. And these neighborhood challenges are problematic for India, both policy-wise and reputationally. One of the Modi government's signature policies is its neighborhood first policy, which is meant to prioritize shoring up relations with its South Asian neighbors, and yet it's struggling to fulfill that policy. Additionally, India is keen to project itself globally as a rising, responsible world power, and yet it's hard to make that argument if you're having trouble getting along with your own neighbors and working things out in your own backyard. A second key geopolitical implication emerging from the Ladakh crisis, and this really follows from the first one, is that China's footprint in South Asia is really growing. As I said earlier, the main accelerant of Beijing's growing reach in the region is BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. There are 4 South Asia-focused envisioned aspects of BRI. The most well-known one is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in Pakistan, but there is also a Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Economic Corridor, which India has not surprisingly rejected and is not involved in that. There is a Trans-Himalayan Corridor involving Nepal, and a Maritime Silk Road Initiative enveloping Bangladesh, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. But the Ladakh crisis shows how Beijing doesn't only use the carrot of BRI to build out its presence in the region, but also, I would argue, the stick of military provocations. So first we had Doklam, or recently we had Doklam, and now even more recently we have Ladakh. A third geo implication is that the risk of regional conflict has increased. Now, I do not want to overstate this risk. I don't want to be an alarmist, so I won't be. No one can afford a war, especially amid a pandemic and severe economic stress. I doubt there will be a conflict. But the environment is increasingly volatile, and that raises the prospects of a miscalculation that could lead to a dangerous escalation. Keep in mind that not only India-China relations, but also India-Pakistan relations are experiencing one of their lowest points in years. New Delhi and Islamabad both worry that the other will take advantage of the Ladakh crisis to harm the other. New Delhi worries that Pakistan will take advantage of India being bogged down and distracted on its northern border with China by intensifying pressure on India on its western border with Pakistan, whether through scaling up cross-border shelling or by sending non-state militant assets across the border into Kashmir to stage attacks on Indian security forces. And India even fears, there are even concerns of Pakistan teaming up with its Chinese ally to punish the other somehow, to punish India somehow. Pakistan, meanwhile, worries that India, angered about its lack of capacity to retaliate against China, will take out its frustrations on its weaker Pakistani rival, either by covertly partnering with anti-state forces in Pakistan to sponsor attacks on Cpec and other Chinese interests in Pakistan, or by making some sort of move in disputed areas of Pakistan, especially Gilgit-Baltistan, that are claimed by India and are envisioned to be areas of Cpec construction. India in recent months, well before the Ladakh crisis, has been intensifying these long-standing threats. These are not new threats on the part of India, but the frequency and intensity of these threats that are delivered rhetorically have been more pronounced. I would argue that both sets of fears are either exaggerated or dead wrong, but each side insists that what they fear will indeed happen, and that each side claims to be the main victim and claims that the other will be the aggressor. And yet, even if these fears of a three-way conflict are misplaced, the mere fact that India and Pakistan are harboring these fears is cause for concern, as it ensures a high level of tensions at a very tense moment. And I think even if things don't get as far as some type of conflict, there are other ways that each side can exploit the China-India crisis. There are ways that both India and Pakistan can exploit the India-China crisis to undercut the other. There have been news just in the last few days that China is beginning a new Cpec project in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. And this is something that has always worried India. India has rejected Cpec and BRI on the whole, not just because it goes through areas of South Asia that India considers to be its backyard, but also because Cpec entails a lot of envisioned projects in areas of territory that are disputed and that India claims as its own. A fourth and final implication of the Ladakh crisis is that U.S.-India relations stand to further improve, but with a potential catch. The Trump administration views New Delhi as a key partner in U.S. efforts to build out its Indo-Pacific strategy because it sees India as an emerging power, both economic and military, with the capacity to work with the U.S. to counterbalance Beijing. The Trump administration also sees India and the U.S. united in their concern about China's growing power and the threat it poses to Indian and U.S. interests. And the Ladakh crisis certainly underscores the harm that China can inflict on India from the perspective of Washington. And I think it's quite telling that Washington took on a more public role in the Ladakh crisis than is typically the case when you have these border spats between India and China. Usually when you have these border standoffs between the two, the U.S. tends to stay quiet. In more recent cases, it's offered intelligence support to India. It did that during the Doklam standoff, but that's about it. But in this case, with Ladakh, several very senior U.S. leaders, including Alice Wells, who until recently was the top South Asia official at the State Department, as well as Eliot Engel, the influential chair of the House International Relations Committee in Congress. Leaders like these, and there are many more of them, have been critical of China very publicly for its moves in Ladakh. Washington's more public response this time around is certainly a function of a hostile U.S.-China relationship, case of the U.S. wanting to get out there to point out just how dangerous and provocative China's activities are. But I think that it's also an indication of its concern about its strategic partner India, or its envisioned strategic partner India, getting embroiled in dispute with China, America's top strategic rival. But here comes the catch that I referred to. Yes, the India-China border dispute can and will strengthen the U.S.-India relationship because it underscores their shared concern about China. It has worsened India-China relations. It could prompt New Delhi to move closer to the U.S. But despite all that, more into the longer term, I would argue that it actually risks exposing the limits of U.S.-India partnership because it may highlight India's limitations in pushing back against China, which is the very thing that the U.S. wants India to do per the Indo-Pacific strategy. What do I mean by this? Well, India was provoked by China in the Ladakh crisis. There were PLA forces entering areas that India considers its own. And yet, as I mentioned before, India's retaliatory options have been limited, aside from some economic punishments meant to appease an angry public. India has limited retaliatory options because it is the less powerful rival vis-a-vis China. Additionally, and so in essence, I think the fear is that if the U.S.-India relationship were to get closer, there would be an expectation on the U.S.'s part that India would be more willing to push back against China. But as we've seen in the Ladakh crisis, there are limitations to what India can do. Additionally, if India formally moves into the U.S. camp, and that remains a big if, but if that were to happen and the two become true allies, then there would be great pressure on India to engage in more operational cooperation with the U.S. This is what the U.S. expects of its top strategic rivals. It would want India to engage in joint patrols with the U.S. in the waters of the Indo-Pacific, for example. India has long resisted these types of things, not just because of the ghosts of non-alignment, but also because of an unwillingness to antagonize China. But things are different, if you assume things are different, if India does move closer to the US and it continues to resist this type of operational collaboration for whatever reason, then that could impact US-India relations in a big way. Because if India does not agree to that type of alliance behavior after essentially becoming an ally of the US, then when would it ever agree to do so? The bottom line is that the Ladakh crisis has established a new global flashpoint, given just how intense the India-China relationship is, given how tense it will continue to be even when the current crisis is resolved. I think it's just a matter of time until there is a new border crisis. And after the deadly events of June 15th, there is a strong likelihood that in future crises, each side will dispense with long-standing protocol that forbids the use of firearms during clashes. Each side will want to better protect itself, and you can protect yourself a lot better with firearms than with fisticuffs. Heavier weaponry means heavier violence. Heavier violence means the prospects of more escalation. And all of this would happen against the backdrop of a nuclear-armed triangle of India, Pakistan, and China. So to conclude, let's zoom out again, and no pun intended, given the platform that we're using here. Let's zoom out to where we began, which was with a bird's eye view of the India-China relationship. And I had spoken at the beginning about the long-standing tensions over the border, and indeed those will linger in a big way. But there's a whole other dimension of India-China rivalry that will likely become all the more salient in the coming years. Both countries are actively competing for overseas energy resources and raw materials in response to their growing economies and energy needs. And of course, China has taken a big lead on this with BRI. But with these supplies becoming all the more precious, expect that competition to heat up in the coming days and potentially down the road leading to war. And a lot of this competition will not take place on land. It will take place at sea. Just to close with a brief anecdote, I remember speaking to a retired Indian general some years ago during a visit to New Delhi. And this retired general felt very strongly that there will be another India-China war one day. He was insistent, it's just a matter of time. Sometime in the next few decades it's going to happen. And he said that it will not be over the disputed border, but instead it will take place at sea, perhaps in the Bay of Bengal or a similar water body, over a fight for natural resources. And I think that's very interesting, that given that our focus is understandably so on this border dispute and land, you look at the China-India rivalry more broadly, and I think that you have to look at the sea-based manifestations, particularly in the coming months and years as we start talking about increasingly precious natural resources and raw materials. So Michael, before I can regale the audience with more gloomy news, I'll end there and look forward to questions.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that, and very helpful to be reminded that there is a huge strategic context in which these border clashes take place, and that reminds me of one interesting point that seemed to emerge from the meeting we held last week with Rudra Chowdhury. Some of the audience who were there may recall that data that he has been working on in relation to tensions on the India-Pakistan border, and which he will be publishing in September, do appear to show a striking correlation between both the frequency and severity of what are in themselves small-scale border clashes, with the extent to which there is or is not at any given time a meaningful dialogue going on between the governments of India and Pakistan. Now, the data that he is working on obviously does not exist for the China-India border, but I wondered whether your own observations suggested that there was a correlation in that respect here as well. I mean, does the willingness of soldiers at disputed areas of the border to clash with each other reflect, so far as you can tell, the general atmosphere of the relationship, or are they something separate?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll also look forward to seeing that data on India-Pakistan when it's available. It sounds like a fascinating project. So it's a good question as to whether we might be able to make a similar argument in the India-China context. My sense is probably not. I think that on some levels the analogies are not fair, just in the sense that, you know, when it comes to the India-China relationship, there's more dialogue and less border violence than there is in the India-Pakistan relationship. I mean, I've been speaking about how, you know, there have been fairly frequent border spats between India and China, and there'll be quite a few more. And, you know, when the next ones come, given what happened in this current crisis, we could see violence. But that's unusual, that's rare. If you look back over the last few decades, ever since India and China fought their war in the 1960s, you know, these border spats are frequent, but they're rarely violent. And, you know, I would argue as well that both, if you look at just the last few years, both leaders, Xi and Modi, have been big proponents of talks and dialogue, and yet there have been some, you know, a few spats that have cropped up even when they've been doing that. You know, there was the Wuhan summit, and then there was the summit outside of Chennai. These happened just over the last few years. The objective, or one of the objectives of those summits, was for the two leaders to figure out ways for the countries to continue to get along and promote dialogue, despite the border problems. And yet, you know, you had the more recent summits not too long ago, and then you have this crisis breakout in Ladakh, you know, just over the last few weeks, which became very violent. So I'm not sure if one could make a similar argument in this case as you could with India, Pakistan. I do think that once temperatures have lowered and emotions are not as raw, and once this current crisis winds down, I do imagine that there will probably be, though it could take some time, there will be new efforts on very high levels, both the Indian and the Chinese governments, to get back to this so-called Wuhan spirit. Now, of course, Wuhan spirit, you talk about that now, may convey a different implication than what it did previously, but Wuhan spirit is this idea that the two countries can work together and can figure out ways to partner despite tensions, and can work out ways to have dialogue. It'll be much harder to justify bringing back that Wuhan spirit now than it would have been in the recent past, just because you have the relationship in such a bad place. But I do think that there will be a push for that, but it will not lead to less, I don't think it would lead to fewer clashes, just because, you know, again, the bad blood between the militaries, especially those out in these remote, inaccessible areas who are sort of stuck there thinking about how angry they are, that's not going to dissipate. So I think that no matter what the politicians and the diplomats may be doing, no matter how much dialogue is taking place, you know, there could still be a spat that could turn violent at any time.
Thank you. Well, that leads quite well into a couple of questions that have come in relating very specifically to the border. Victoria Schofield notes, you've suggested that there may have to be some form of compromise to diffuse the Ladakh crisis. But she says, given that India has provocatively emphasized that Aksai Chin is part of Ladakh, what prospect is there of any compromise? Perhaps withdrawing troops on the line of actual control back to their original positions may not be enough.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The questioner is exactly right in this context, and especially because the mood is particularly tense right now. You know, I imagine that you know, each side is going to want to make large-scale demands. I mean, for example, China is probably going to expect, or it's going to demand that India cease any future road building along, you know, particular areas of the line of actual control. India is not going to do that. China has more leverage because it's the stronger player, because it has these, it still has forces on India's side of the border, and so I think it's in a bigger position to, it's in a stronger position to make those demands. But it's really hard to say. I totally agree that you know, reverting to the status quo ante may not be enough. I mean, it may be enough for the near term, but it won't be enough to avert this crisis and these tensions more broadly. And again, neither side, even if China has more leverage here, neither side is going to want to back down. Saving face is going to be critically important. And I think that's what it really comes down to, is how can you wind things down in a way that each side can save face? You're looking at two very nationalistic governments, populations that are particularly concerned, particularly India's population. There's much less evidence that the Chinese public is very much focused on this, because I think the Chinese government and the state-run media have been relatively quiet about what's going on, compared to India, which of course is a whole different system, and there's a lot of information out there. But a lot of public pressure on Modi to do something, so to speak. Again, the options are limited. So my best answer to that question is, indeed, I agree that going back to the status quo ante is not enough. And I think that basically what that would entail is bringing a bit of short-term breathing room to both sides, which would perhaps lead to an uneasy peace during the bad weather months. But once we get back to, say next year or so, or once the weather gets better next year, there could be another flare-up. Or there could, of course, even be flare-ups when the weather is bad. That's happened in the past as well. So I think that we're looking at a situation that may be diffused in the short term, but certainly not over the longer run.
Thank you. I mean, just on the specifics of what would happen in the event of an armed clash, James Noble's comments that conventional wisdom is that the PLA would overwhelm Indian defences, but he says recent analysts have written that India has more military experience with recent conflicts, that India has had as well greater ease in putting troops into the region than the PLA. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a very good point, and there was a very important and influential study that was produced by the Belfer Center at Harvard a few weeks ago by several, I believe, American analysts who essentially made this very argument that indeed, broadly speaking, China has the stronger conventional forces, conventional military forces, but along the border, India may actually have an advantage because of a demonstrated ability to manage the terrain and so on. So that suggests, perhaps, that India may well have, in due course, some options to stage some type of retaliations against China that many think that it doesn't have. But it's tough to get to that point. One thing that we've seen with India over the last few years is that it actually, despite all we talk about it being a strong rising power with a military modernization plan and all that, it still has struggled to muster the capacity to carry out military retaliations, including against its weaker rival, Pakistan. I think that when India decided to respond to Pakistan last year, after you had that terrorist attack in Kashmir that India blamed on Pakistan, India staged a limited strike in Balakot, which is an area of Pakistan, in Pakistan proper, so to speak. It's not in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, it's in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. But there's a lot of controversy about that. There were a number of prominent analysts that said that India actually missed its targets. It was going after terrorist training camps, or said it was going after terrorist training camps, and it missed them. And there was a lot of controversy to the point that many believe that India has bungled even what would consider to be easier, so to speak, retaliatory moves against Pakistan, which of course is a much less powerful country than China is. So that suggests that even if you can identify some potential ways for India to respond, retaliate militarily, capacity-wise, strategically, it may be difficult to get to a point where it could actually carry out some type of effective strike. Now, obviously, there are other ways that India could try to retaliate that are not military. And I've already spoken about economic retaliations, but I think those are limited. Political moves that it may try to make, diplomatic moves, those are all possibilities as well, especially because India, I think, tends to get a lot of support from the international community vis-a-vis its position when it comes to China. But I don't think we should overstate the capacity, the potential for India to try to punish India militarily, at least not in the near term.
Thank you. Well, David, touching on India's other options, and as you have implied also, David Taylor has commented that in India's problem is that attempts to impose economic sanctions will in effect be shooting themselves in the foot. Scott Gibbons, I beg your pardon, says, indeed, the limits of Indian power have been revealed and the actual China-Pakistan alliance confirmed. What do you expect will be the next major step in the US-India partnership that will directly address the Indian border crisis?
Well, it's interesting that, as I had mentioned earlier, the U.S. had been, in Washington, there had been a number of rare public statements from senior U.S. leaders criticizing China, expressing support for India. But that was before the crisis escalated, when you had the deadly exchange on June 15th. Ever since then, there's been a bit of less messaging from the U.S. government. I mean, there have been some comments. President Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, had come out and said that China is acting aggressively. We support India. There have been several things like that, but not all that much, which makes me think that at least now in the short term, the U.S. does not want to take on a public role. I mean, it's never taken on a public role in the past. Typically, when you have these border spats, there has never been there's never been third-party mediation. There's been a dialogue process set up, and India and China have talked things through. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, you have that dialogue process in place now. It was actually launched early in June, before you had that deadly crisis, and before you had that deadly exchange. Certainly, this crisis is more serious than previous ones, which suggests that perhaps there would be the need for some type of third-party mediation if things really get out of control. But it's quite interesting that there has been some signals of a potential third party getting involved to try to diffuse this crisis. It hasn't been the U.S., but it's been Russia. There was a three-way dialogue between India, China, and Russia several weeks ago. That the public statements were that nothing was discussed about Ladakh. I'm not sure about that. But it brings up a very interesting point that for all we talk about how this crisis will strengthen U.S.-India relations, and it will, I think you really need to look at the Russia factor as something significant here. India has long had a close relationship with Russia. It was a key partner during the Cold War. And while the U.S.-India relationship has been growing in a big way, the India-Russia relationship has not gone away. And there's this major missile defense deal that India has completed with Russia, which has made the U.S. very unhappy. And I think that if you look at how the U.S.-India relationship could evolve and strengthen in the post-Ladakh crisis environment, you sort of have to think about where the India-Russia relationship is going to go, because I imagine it could be difficult. I spoke about some of the potential limitations that could come for the U.S.-India relationship with this crisis, in terms of if India continues to resist acting operationally in the ways that the U.S. would want it to, and concerns about India not having the capacity to be able to counterbalance China in the ways that the U.S. would want it to. But if India continues to have this defense relationship with Russia, I think that could limit the scope of U.S.-India strategic partnership, because we could talk about the soft spot that President Trump has for Vladimir Putin and all that stuff. But bottom line is that the U.S. and Russia are very, very bitter rivals, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. So I think that the Russia factor could present a potential problem in that regard.
That's very interesting. Gerald Dorey wonders how far China's acting against India now because of the US and the next presidential elections. How does China expect the USA to react? What you were just saying about the relationship with Russia suggests that there may be controlling factors in that. But what can you say about that?
Well, I think that clearly the fact that the U.S.-China relationship is so bad right now, I think had to be a factor driving China's activities in Ladakh, but also its activities in the South China Sea, where you have several countries that are close to the United States that are party to that crisis, to that conflict. And would I say that that China would not have staged these provocations in Ladakh if the U.S.-China relationship was a better place? No, not necessarily. There are a bunch of other reasons that I outlined that suggest that you still would have had these provocations even if the U.S.-China relationship was in a better place. But I do think that it was a major contributing factor, and I think that just in the last few weeks, some of the things that President Trump himself has said, which are not at all surprising, because for years in his books and his statements and interviews, President Trump has been hard on China all the time. So we saw this coming. But I do think that was a factor because China knows, as I said, this U.S.-India-China triangle, that China can indirectly hurt the United States by pinning down and staging these provocations and getting involved in a violent crisis with the country that the U.S. considers to be arguably its best strategic bet in South Asia, that being India, and a country that China knows the U.S. views as the country that is best placed in South Asia, and perhaps in Asia on the whole, to push back against China and to counterbalance its rising power. In terms of how does China expect the U.S. to react? Well, I mean, one can never predict Trump and his administration. That's sort of become a cliche. It's very difficult for analysts to know what could be coming next. But there's talk about a new Cold War between the U.S. and China. I don't know if I'd go that far, but certainly, so long as the Trump administration remains in power, so long as Trump remains president, I think we're going to see a lot more escalations, at least in the rhetorical context. And especially with the presidential election coming up, you get a lot of political mileage, and not just if you're Trump, but either any type of political candidate, presidential candidate can get a lot of mileage by accusing China of stealing American jobs, especially when you have this economic crisis we have in the U.S. right now. But I think that there is bipartisan support in Washington for taking a much harder line on China than has been the case in previous years. And so I think that even if Joe Biden becomes the next US president, I think this rivalry will continue to intensify, perhaps not at the pace that it's happening now with Trump, but I think it will continue to intensify. And I think the place to look, though, and I imagine China will be looking at this in terms of how the US may react, would not necessarily be Ladakh, but it would be in the South China Sea, because there's so much more action there. There are more countries involved, including countries important to the United States. And so, as I understand it, there have been one, maybe two U.S. Aircraft carriers that have been dispatched into the waters of the South China Sea. I think that's meant to project force, strength, intimidation, not much else, but that's significant. Just to end here, in most recent conversations I've had with Chinese analysts, they basically seem to think that the U.S.-China relationship is in a very bad place right now. It's not going to get any better. They're a lot more optimistic about China-India relations. They think there's a lot more potential for trying to conciliate and move forward there. But just a lot of resignation in the sense that we can't expect things to get any better. They may not get worse, but they're not going to get any better.
Thank you. Well, we are almost out of time, but I have one last question that I'm particularly keen to ask, and this was sent in advance by Robert Folks, who asks, I hope the speaker can say, the speaker may not thank me for this incidentally, but I hope the speaker can say something about the border as settled between Ladakh and Tibet in the 17th century and agreed between the 5th Dalai Lama and the King of Ladakh. This allowed for a peaceful border and open economic links, which lasted up until about 1950. Michael.
That's a great way to end, going back deep into history. Well, the only thing I could say there is that I think it is remarkable that as you suggested, there was an agreement. I think there was a treaty that was signed in 1687, 1689, something like that. That between the Dalai Lama of the time and the King of Ladakh, there was an agreement on borders that indeed managed to lasts for quite a few centuries, even though there were a series of aggressions and incursions and all types of things that happened in the 100 years after that. And you know, what really brought it down, what brought down the understanding and support for that border agreement coming out of the late 17th century, you know, it was the modern Chinese states' adaptation or adoption of communism. That's when things changed with Tibet, and that's when everything changed with the Dalai Lama having to going into exile in India, and all that. So, you know, I think it does show that some level of resiliency, that you had this agreement that was, you know, well before anything came with the attempts by the British to set borders. And anything like that. This goes way back, and it shows that there was a willingness to respect, at least in name, these borders, even though, you know, there were a lot of attempts to get around them and undermine that treaty. But I think that it just goes to show, not to be very obvious, but you know, you talk about this part of the world and you talk about borders. Everything has been contested for such a long time, and everything will continue to be contested for such a long time. But at least you do have this one success story of a treaty that did propose an agreement on borders that was, to a significant extent, respected for several hundred years. And I think that's important. It gives some hope for the future, but not anytime soon.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. I mean, as an island nation, Britain is not perhaps terribly good at understanding land borders, although if Scotland becomes independent, we will have to learn again. It remains for me to say thank you, Michael, for a very interesting and informative talk. And I would say a lively discussion, although it always seems a bit strange to talk about liveliness in this sort of stilted environment of a Zoom conference, but nevertheless, some excellent questions and answers. Thank you very much. And thank you also to our audience. You are, after all, the reason we do these things. We have 2 more events before the end of this month, and then we will close for August. Our last meeting of the month, on the 29th of July, will return to the subject of China, and in particular to current concerns around Chinese espionage. But next week, we have a rather different event. We have a very distinguished 5-member panel talking about the Asian University for Women. The AUW was set up to help women from across Asia, irrespective of their backgrounds, ethnicity, wealth, to achieve their potential and to contribute to their own societies. It already has a significant record of achievement, but like all of us, it has been hurt by the impact of COVID-19. I hope you will join us to hear about what it has done and how we in the RSAA can help to sustain this important initiative. The Vice-Chancellor of the AUW is Professor Nirmala Rao, a former member of the Council and long-term friend of this society. And she will be joined by the university's Chancellor, Sherry Blair QC, Esra Hassan, a graduate of the AUW currently studying at the University of Sussex, Lady Judy Moody-Stewart, who has led fundraising efforts on behalf of the university in the UK, and Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, a former Indian High Commissioner to the UK, among other places, and a trustee of the Asian University for Women. So we can promise you a deeply informed and diverse set of presentations. Do please join us next week. Thank you very much for joining us today, and goodbye for now.